Tonight, we're going to be speaking about self-awareness, the Bible, and you. And yes, there's a theme. I think a couple weeks ago, I spoke on the past, the Bible, and you. And so when we talk about self-awareness, we are talking about your awareness of how you perceive, process, and present yourself to the world. Or another way to look at self-awareness is, what are people likely to experience when they're in a relationship with you? Both of these ideas are all over Scripture. And this subject of self-awareness, the importance of it cannot be underestimated. It's what we might call something that's vital. And I love to study like our anatomy, and I don't like going to the doctors, but I like what the doctors know. I just don't like finding out things are wrong with me, because it always means some type of pain and a lot of money. But I remember I was talking to my orthopedist, and we were talking about when I was training for Ironman about the things that are absolutely necessary for a body and an endurance sport. And so when you think about self-awareness, we're talking about something that you can't go without. It's like a vital organ, right? And self-awareness is a prerequisite for all healthy, thriving relationships. Let me say that again. Self-awareness is a prerequisite for all healthy, thriving relationships, whether they would be with God or with people. And I'll even extend this even into work and with things. You cannot be saved without a degree of self-awareness. Yes, I said that. You cannot be saved or be in a right relationship with God without a degree of self-awareness. How does that work? Well, because the Christian gospel, the biblical gospel, says that God's holy and just. We're not, and that's actually a problem. And the way to make that right is to acknowledge that God so loved us that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever should believe in him should have eternal life. So in order for you to recognize that chasm that exists between what God tells you to do and what you're constantly not doing, and to recognize God's salvation gift, you have to have a level of self-awareness. Oh, I'm not what God calls me to be. I'm not who God calls me to be. I'm not doing the thing God is calling me to do. That's a level of awareness. So you can't be saved without a level of self-awareness. And people who don't have this and are religious are obnoxious. Because they think more highly of themselves than they ought to. But you cannot have a healthy and growing relationship with God without self-awareness, acknowledging who he is and who you are and how dependent you are. And again, having loving relationships, no matter where they exist, in the home, between spouses, between children, you can't have them. And I like to say, when I've done this in like organizations, that immorality kills its thousands. Immorality causes tons of relational dysfunctions. But a lack of self-awareness does this to millions. If you are in a workplace, I guarantee you that the main problems you're facing as you're working with people, whether you're in school, it doesn't matter what job you're in, if you're virtual, it does not matter. I guarantee you the main relational issues you're dealing with is people who are not self-aware. And when I say people, that includes you too. Because when you're not self-aware, you have something that I call relational halitosis. You know what halitosis is? It's when you have bad breath. And here's the thing about bad breath. When you have bad breath, everyone knows you have it, but you don't know you have it. And so when you're not self-aware, you're not aware of what people are likely to experience when they're in relationship with you. But as believers, we're called to be like Jesus so that when people experience us, they can experience a little bit of Jesus. And the gap that exists between where you are in your walk with Jesus and being like Jesus and where you need to be, that gap, in order to close that gap, by means of the Spirit and the Word and fellowship and all the what we call the means of grace, you need to be aware of that. So the Bible encourages us to be self-aware. Let's look at Romans 12:3. As we read this verse, I want you to think about this concept. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to what? Think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. Now, when I read the Bible, sometimes, I was taught by a navigator, and he said, when you read the Bible, always ask questions. So one of my questions of this text is, why would Paul, writing to a church, need to tell the church this? Why would he need to tell them, for by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, which means pastors, deacons, leaders, evangelists, mothers, fathers, single people, old people, young people, all different ethnicities, everyone means everyone, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Why would he need to say that? Because there were people, watch this, in the church thinking more highly of themselves than they ought to think. You see that happens in the church? It happens in the church. Many of the things that are happening in the world, going on in the world, we're susceptible to the same things. Now watch what he says. But to think with sober judgment. So there's this exaggerated thought of yourself, and then there's a sober judgment of yourself. Now, in order to know this, one is called to awareness. Are you aware that you have a propensity at times to think more highly of yourself than you ought to think? I don't know if I'm aware of that. Paul's saying you need to be aware of that. And the reason why you need to be aware of that is because when people think more highly of themselves than they ought, they treat people accordingly, and it's not good the way they treat people, right? Each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So the Bible encourages you to be aware, think of this as kind of like a personality thermometer, right? Especially when we've had kids, been around kids, it's starting to get what we would call winter. Like 2 days ago, people had jackets on here in Florida, right? It's starting to get in the 60s and 70s. And what comes with that is colds and flus. And when you start feeling achy, one of the things we do is we get a thermometer. Why do we get a thermometer? Because we want to know our body's temperature. Why do we want to know the body temperature? Because the body tells the score. It will tell you if something's going on with it, if it's fighting an infection. So you put the thermometer now up against your head, or you go old school under the tongue, and it reads, and it comes out as something. These verses are like personality thermometers. I want you to measure yourself up against them. But not only does the Bible encourage us to be self-aware, the Bible warns us against not being self-aware. We see this in Galatians 6:3. Look what this verse says. For if anyone thinks he is something when he's nothing, what does it say? He deceives himself. Stop. Again, this letter is written not just to one church, but to multiple churches in a region. My question is, so you mean to tell me Paul actually had to write a letter to groups of Christians gathered in all different places and tell them there may be some people in your church that think they are something when they're not? In other words, they have an inflated view of themselves because they're not self-aware. They don't know who they are. They're not adopting who God's called them to be. And they think something of themselves that it's not accurate. Their level of self-awareness on a scale of 1 to 10 is like 1, 2, 3. And then he says this, if anyone thinks he's something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. How important is self-awareness? Well, it's so important that Paul says, I need to warn you against being deluded in your mind about who you are. You need to have an accurate view of yourself, that you're created in God's image, that you're fallen in Adam, you're not imperfect, and that if you are to be right with God, it's by grace, through grace alone, through faith. And that you're not any better than anybody else. You have to start right there. And that takes a level and calls for a level of self-awareness. But the clearest text on self-awareness in all of the Bible is actually found in a very familiar story in the Old Testament in Exodus chapter 34. And I want us to go there. And I want to show you this text is, to me, it's a fun text, right? It's a fun text. So when we're reading this text, I want you to pay attention to the theme. What we're on is this theme of self-awareness. and what we can learn from it, all right? So when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, he came down from the mountain. Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. And we'll just stop right there for now. Okay, so what's going on? Moses has been with God, and he's got the 2 tablets of stone. Anybody know what those are? What are they? Those 10 commandments. How important are the 10 commandments? They're pretty important, right? Yeah. From those of us who've been walking with God and know our Bibles, we know that 10 commandments are kind of a big deal, right? A really big deal. They were the sign of God's covenant, along with circumcision, to the old covenant people, Israel, and they transcend over the old covenant all the way in the new covenant. So God has this transcendent law which emanates from his holiness and the fact that he's perfect. So Moses has got the 10 commandments, the tablets of stone that God wrote in his hands, right? And now the Bible says he's going to come down the mountain from Sinai, and he's got them in his hands. Now, let me ask you another question. What do you think Moses is going to do with those 10 commandments? What do you think he's going to do? What do you think God wants him to do? And if you're thinking, well, God wants him to tell the people about the 10 commandments. Correct. So let's set this up. You've got Moses called by God. He's got the 10 commandments. His job is to go down the mountain and to tell people about the 10 commandments. That sounds like a mission to me. It sounds like purpose to me. It sounds like calling to me. It sounds like a life worthy of living to me. Except the text says, when Moses came, stand 29, when Moses came down, look what it says. Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. So let's pause here and let's think through this critically. So Moses was with God. He received the 10 commandments. Moses was with God in a way that I could argue none of y'all have ever been with God, and neither have I. Like Moses was face to face with God. At one point, right, earlier in Exodus, Moses had asked to see God's glory. And God said, you can't see my face and live. I'll show it to you through a crack. I mean, at one point in the Old Testament, God refers to Moses as his friend, as the most humble person ever. And in Jesus' ministry, when he was on a mountain, there appeared Moses and Elijah. Like Moses is a really big deal, a really spiritual, in-tune guy. I mean, he's a Hall of Famer. He's on the mountain, as it were, right? Of all the faces of these people. So he's in with God. He's got these commandments, and there was something about himself that he did not know. So in Michael Crawford's brain, I'm thinking, okay, so if Moses could be in a period of time where he wasn't self-aware, is it possible that that could happen to me? Yes. If Moses could be in a place in his life where he wasn't self-aware, is it possible that that could happen to you? Yes. You say, well, isn't that why we get with God? Well, Moses was with God, and he was communing with God, and he had received the very commandments of God. You don't get more spiritual than what Moses was doing. What's the point, Michael? The point is, spirituality and fellowship and communion with God does not necessarily protect you from not being self-aware. And I know some of you think, oh, yes, it does. No, it doesn't, because if it did, it would have worked here. And it didn't. So there was something Moses didn't know. What did he know? He didn't know that something was up with his face. It was shining with his face. Let's look at verse 30. Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. Time out. Challenge flag again. Hold on a second. So you mean to tell me y'all knew Moses was up on the mountain, and you knew he was with God because the other texts say there was lightning and thunder and all that stuff, and he told you he was going up there to get the commandments and all that stuff, and he comes back down, and you see him carrying the tablets. but you don't notice the tablets. You're unconcerned with the tablets. According to this text, where is the focus of the people of Israel? What does the text say? On his face. And why is the attention on his face? Because it's shining. It's not normal. And this isn't the vernacular like, I'm shining, I'm flossing. No. Something's up with your face. So pause again. Moses' job is to take those commandments and teach the people the commandments. But there's something messing that up. There's something getting in the way of that. There's something that's now an obstacle for Moses and for the people that's hindering the people of God from getting the commandments. And it's not Satan. It's not Moses' infidelity. It's not Moses is a bad preacher, or it's not Moses didn't have his quiet time. There's something physical going on with his face. And here's the deal. Moses didn't know it was happening. He just came right down the mountain like, we're going to get it in, get these commandments. And notice what it says. The skin of his face shone, and what emotion were they experiencing? What does the text say? They're afraid. So what do we learn from this? We learn that it's possible when you're not self-aware, people are going to experience you. And when you're not self-aware, you're going to relate something to people that could possibly put them in a situation where they can't receive what you actually want them to receive, right? So I always tell the story of, let's imagine that there's a young man and he's trying to win over the heart of a young woman. And he comes to her apartment, he knocks on the apartment, she opens up and he has some flowers, right? And let's just make them yellow so we don't get too far down the line. They're not red yet, right? And he goes like this, here. What do you mean here? What do you mean here? Here. She goes, what? How am I supposed to take? Like, are you angry? Like, did someone die? Like, I don't think I'm getting what you were trying to do. That's what's happening here with Moses. All of our lack of self-awareness always has relational consequences. Always. Always, 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 always. Always. There's no exception to this rule. Every ounce of lack of self-awareness in me and in you has relational consequences. So what happened? Verse 31, but Moses called them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, which is interesting because that means they were so afraid they left. So mission was aborted. Things are going bad. So he calls them back, and the text says, and Moses talked with them. So the text doesn't say, but what do you think they talked about? Yeah, do you think Moses went, what guys, what happened? I got the tablets and you guys all took off running like there's an alien coming out of me or something. And they're like, there is. Dude, have you seen your face? Well, actually, no, because I don't have an iPhone 16 where I can take a selfie. And I don't have mirrors. The only reflection I might be able to get is if I could get to some water because, water reflects it. And I might not know that, so I have no idea. I mean, I've got these commandments, and I'm excited to teach you, and I want you to know God's will, and I want to do God's will. But Moses, we're not trying to hear that right now. We are utterly freaked out by the way your face looks. What else does it say? Afterward, all the people of Israel came near, and he commanded them all that the Lord had spoken with him in Mount Sinai. Wait a second. How did they go from being afraid and not receptive to Moses to now the mission's back on? Well, the key is in that conversation, isn't it? And though it's not explicit, it's implicit. And you know how we know that? Because of verse 33. And when Moses had finished speaking with them, what does the text say he did? He put a veil over his face. Why do you think he did that? This isn't a deep theological question. Why would he put a veil over his face? Cover the shame. Why would he do that? Because it was a what? A distraction. Okay, now this has been really teaching like, this is someone, what did you learn at Paradise? Oh, this is a self-awareness thing. We saw some cute things. And it's not, the cuteness is over. So, veils. He put a veil over his face? Okay. If I was Moses, and I'm not Moses, but if I was Moses, I might be tempted to think, why do I need to put a veil over my face? I was with God. Where were you guys? You guys were down there. You weren't with God. I don't even know. You guys are probably clowning, doing some nonsense. Like listening to goats, playing dice, talking about nonsense, while I was up on the mountain in communion with the Lord Most High, receiving the very commandments of God that will save your life. And I come down with a shine, and you guys are like, oh my gosh, we can't take it. Your face is so amazing. We're so afraid. What happened? I'm just telling you my carnality. If I was Moses, I'd be like, my face is shining? Word? Seriously? Somebody give me a mirror. Dude, you mean I've got physical evidence that I've been with God and I got commandments? Oh, y'all, you can't stop me now. I'm about to write a book, how to meet with God, get commandments, and have your face shine in 10 easy steps. I'm going to platform that thing. I'm going to have millions. I'm going to go viral. I'm going to do all this stuff. I'm going to teach people how to do it. And if anybody comes at me talking about, but your face is a distraction, I'm going to say, man, that's demonic. I was with God and I got commandments. That's your problem, not my problem. I didn't put this shine on me. I got this shine from who? God. Well, you know, Brother Moses, don't you think you should do something about that shine so it's not a distraction? No, that's your problem, not my problem. I'm authentic. I'm keeping it real. You just need to accept me. After all, this is the evidence that I was with God, that I was in such proximity with the Lord Most High that my face is shining. You guys should be celebrating me. You should be platforming me. You should be exalting me. You should be almost worshiping me. I'm that dude. Except that wasn't Moses' posture. Moses' disposition was, why are you guys so afraid and why are you running away from me? How come, what's happening? Dude, have you looked at your face? No, what's up with it? It's shining, it's weird, it's totally freaking us out. What's the most important thing? God. What's the most important thing? Others. What does that sound like? Love God with all the heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love my neighbors myself. What's my mission? Get the commandments to the people. What's hindering that? My shining face. Where did the shining face come? From God. But what's the hindrance? The thing that God gave me, which is actually a really cool thing. What should I do with it? Michael Crawford says, that's their problem, not your problem. Moses said, give me a veil so I can cover it up. Who does that remind you of? Should remind you of Jesus, Philippians 2, who although existed in the form of God, did not consider it a thing to be considered equal with God, and humbled himself and became a servant even up to the point of death. John 1 says he came to his own and his own did not even recognize. You realize when Jesus was on the earth, he was God and people walked right past him. And when he would teach and exert authority, they would go, bro, we know your brothers and your family and you're from the hood. You're from the ghetto. You're from Nazareth. That's not a place, like nobody good, nothing good comes from Nazareth. Like, we can't physically see that you're like God. And then you have all these claims. You see absolute humility. And what you see in this text is Moses is willing to take something that God gave him as a mark of strength, a mark of fidelity, a mark of obedience, a mark of celebration, something of glory, and say, if it distracts the brothers and sisters, I'll put a veil on it. Let's go a little bit deeper. Who wore veils in Moses' day? Men didn't wear veils. Women wore veils. Men did not wear veils in Moses' day. They didn't wear no veils. Women wore the veils. Women covered themselves. Moses says, give me something to put over my face. I can imagine the macho dudes going, bro, you're out of control now. Come on. I mean, that's what, and Moses says, no, the mission of God and other people are so important, I'm willing to use a veil. I've now become aware that there's something about me that's a distraction for other people's walk with God. I've now become aware that there's something people are experiencing other than God. Even if it's a strength, I'm willing to veil it so that they could be saved. I'm willing to veil it so that they can experience love. I'm willing to veil it so that they can get to God, says very few people. But Moses was willing to veil it. Look what 34 says. Whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he came out. And when he came out, he told the people of Israel what he was commanded. Watch what it says. The people of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses was shining, and Moses would what? Put the veil over his face again until he went in to speak with him. This text is such a beautiful text that starts with the idea that Moses was not self-aware that there was something about him that was a potential distraction, an actual distraction from other people getting to God, loving God, being with God. And as James said in Acts 15, we ought not to make it difficult for people who are turning to God. Moses realized that there's a relational impact that corresponds with my lack of self-awareness. Moses became self-aware, not because God told him or the Bible or the commandments, but because of what he saw other people responding to. And people sometimes ask me doing things like this, well, how can I become more self-aware? And we're going to get there in just a minute. But a cheat is you need real friends. And a lot of people don't have real friends. They have what I call, they got friends, but they ain't real. Because a real friend would tell you if your face is shining. But a real friend would say, hey, Moses, your face is shining, and it's absolutely unbelievable, but it's scary. And I don't care what you have to say with them commandments. I can't talk to you with that kind of face. It's just too distracting. A real friend would say, what could we do to help? Like, how do we figure this out? A real friend would tell you. Moses had to learn because Moses learned of his lack of self-awareness through the relational dysfunction, which is a way that you can learn. Is it absolute? No, because not all relational dysfunction is because you lack self-awareness. Some relational dysfunction, failure to love one another as God calls us to, is because someone else's dysfunction, but it's always connected to some level of lack of self-awareness. There is a direct relationship between your level of self-awareness and your relationship with God. If you think you're something and you're actually nothing, you're going to have a I think I'm something relationship with God. And honestly, a lot of people aren't going to dig it unless you get around a lot of other people who think there's something. Then you might work it out in your little tribe. Your level of self-awareness is going to impact your relationship with others. It's going to impact you at work. It's going to impact your quality of life. It just is. We saw it in Moses' life. And the things that typically keep us from being self-aware are some things that you might not think. Like one of them, shame. Shame is an identity-based emotion. We see it in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3. And shame basically says that there's something fundamentally defective about me. So shame is going to say, you don't want to become self-aware, because what does that mean? It's the same reason why some of us don't like going to the doctor. Because what if they find something? I want to run a full blood panel. I don't want to run a full blood panel. Because you might go, oh, you have diabetes, you have this. I want a full body scan, or I want to run this, or I don't want to find out. I don't want to find out. And shame says, oh, you don't want to know. You just want to have a cute, bow-tied Christianity. You don't actually want to be self-aware because shame is personified. And it goes, do you know what you're going to find if you start getting real with God and real with his word and real with other people? You're going to get past the whole veneer into where you really live and abide, which is in here and in here. And there's some ugly stuff in there. And there's some stuff that you've done and people have done to you and things you've done. You don't want to go there. And so shame acts like a barrier. Fear does too, because fear is a proximity-based emotion. And fear says it's a worst-case scenario. If you begin to find out who you really are, it's going to be painful. If other people find out, you're toast. You're going to lose everything. So best-case scenario is just keep it light. And guilt is a performance-based emotion. And it blocks self-awareness by simply saying, if you would have taken your religion seriously and your walk with God, you wouldn't even be here. You wouldn't even need to hear this fool get up here and talk about self-awareness. You'd be there already. But the fact is that you're a knucklehead, and you've blown it, and you've done all this stuff, and you're bad. And there's nothing you're ever going to do. It's always going to be bad. And this is this cloud. Sometimes self-awareness is blocked by prioritizing productivity over presence. Let me do. Because, by the way, some of the most productive people on the planet lack self-awareness. Lack total self-awareness. They're like a raging bull elephant in your job, in your workplace. They have no consciousness of their relational halitosis, of how people feel when they're around them. Zero. And they're very successful. And you know what our culture does with successful people? You should be like them. Productivity over presence. Productivity, being a human doing over a human being. Valuing what I do rather than what do people experience when they're with me. I've already said, another hindrance from self-awareness is not having real friends. At least Moses could call his people together and they could say, hey man, your face is shining and we get it, you got the commandments and you want to teach us and stuff, but we can't pay attention. Your face, it's freaking people out, man. Real friends are willing to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. Real friends are willing to tell you that. And you know if you have a real friend because you're not going to go a year, 2, 3 years without them telling you something you probably didn't want to hear. Another hindrance to self-awareness is religion. I've already pointed this out. Again, sometimes our religion becomes, let me just figure out what I need to believe and let me figure out what I'm supposed to do, belief and behaviors, and I'm good. Totally good. I was in a conference one time, and a lot of times I was in spaces where I was the only minority. And I was sitting at a table, and this one pastor leader was going off about all the things he had done, and he was just so happy. And the other guys were chiming in too about how happy they were, and they had done all these things, and they kept saying, if we keep this up, we're going to be back in the good old days. We're going to bring our churches and our communities back to the good old days. And I said, when were the good old days? He says, like back in the 1800s where churches were serious about the gospel and where they preached the gospel and when there was revivals and the Spirit fell and the Puritans lived. And I said, and when I was a slave? What are we talking? I get, but what are you talking about? They were like, oh, brother, yeah, brother. It's like, yeah, wake up. Wake up, bro. I get it. I wasn't mad, but I was like, this is what happens to us. Beliefs, behaviors, tribe. This is what I believe. This is how I'm going to behave. I'm going to find a tribe, and I'm good. No, you're actually not good. Because God's ultimate purpose for your life is found in Romans 8:29. You're predestined to be conformed into the image of Christ. And that is a process led by the Spirit and the Word and community and church and a daily walk with God. And that word and that process is going to be effective if you have beliefs and behaviors, but it's also going to be effective if you don't lock yourself out of God being able to show you something. Addictions are another big thing that'll stop you from being self-aware. You're addicted to anything. Success is a self-awareness killer. Because when you're successful, you go, well, I'm successful, so how could I not be self-aware? And then, of course, culture. And in all these things, brothers and sisters, when we think about self-awareness and we think about God and we think about his gospel, as I've always said, we have a tremendous invitation. And when I think about self-awareness, I simply think about a target on a wall that's the truth about who Michael Crawford really is. And I can only appreciate God's love and his kindness and his patience and his mercy and his forgiveness to the degree that I understand who I really am. You see, if I think I'm something when I'm nothing, then my interpretation of who God is also affected. Because if I'm something, then God's not that great. I mean, after all, I'm something. That's why he loves me. I'm something. That's why he's merciful. I'm something. That's why that thing worked out. I'm something. That's why I have these good friends. I'm something. And so I not only am manipulating and deceiving myself, I'm also literally changing who God is himself. But that's not the gospel. The gospel is you are who you are. Every single bit of it. Everything God says you are. From being an image bearer, from being loved, from being sinful, from having a heart that's desperately wicked, who can understand it? You are all those things. And you're loved in spite of all of those things. The good news of the gospel is found in us coming to grips with, wow, this is who I really am, and God still sent his son. This is who I really am, and God is in covenant with me and will never leave me and will never forsake me. As the great hymn says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. That man, Newton, who wrote that, was self-aware. Prone to wonder, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart. Take and seal it. Seal it for thy courts above. You can't write those lyrics until you become self-aware. By the way, did you know that the writer of Amazing Grace was a slave trader? Did you guys know that? So when he says, I once was blind, and now I see, that's an amazing statement. The gospel is all about opening your eyes, not just to who you are, but who God is. And as you see God for who he is, the great, almighty, powerful, loving, kind, forgiving, persistent, faithful, unchangeable, covenant, promise-keeping God that doesn't and will never change for you, you go, wow. And then you see who you are. And then you see who Jesus is. This is all good stuff, not bad stuff. So do not let shame and fear and guilt and culture and success and fake friends and all of these addictions and all these things obscure or hinder you or keep you from pressing in, from saying, Lord, show me who I am. There's a text in Psalm 139, which is one of the greatest psalms, in my opinion, ever written around the subject of self-awareness. And listen to what David says, because people say, well, how can I practically become more self-aware? Ask God. Listen to Psalm 139:23. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there are any offensive way in me, and watch this, and lead me in the way everlasting. He's literally saying, God, I don't know enough about myself, And I know that the things that I don't know about myself aren't going to be helpful. So would you show me? Would you search me? Would you lead me? Would you guide me? Would you rip open things? And brothers and sisters, what you don't know about yourself is going to do something in you. So it's better to know it. You want to become more self-aware? Read the Bible for transformation and not information. You want to become more self-aware? Read the Bible for transformation, not information. Read books about the subject. Be intentional and consistently use what I would call self-awareness tools. And ask a few friends to be honest with you, and you got to give them immunity, and say, hey, what do you experience when you're in a relationship with me? Set apart and prioritize time to listen, observe your thoughts and your feelings and your actions and your relationships. Become an observer. Why? Not for self and a self, because you want to be all that God's called you to do. So tonight, we learned a little bit about self-awareness, the Bible, and you. And God always has an invitation. Always. And I don't know what that invitation is for you, but he always has an invitation because there are no accidents. I was thinking as I drove over here, it's almost been exactly 1 year since I moved to Florida. I was living in Baltimore, Maryland. Then I thought to myself, I didn't even know this building existed. And I knew Pastor Tolley was going to start a church, but he started it after I came here. And it took a while for me to get over here because of my schedule. And there's only a few people in this room that I knew prior to me moving here to Florida. What are the odds that I would be here standing in the gap for Pastor Tolley, preaching on a message like self-awareness, just because it's a coincidence? There's no such thing. I don't know what God is inviting you to tonight, but I know he's inviting you to something tonight. I don't know what's standing in the way of you and him, but I know he's inviting you to him. And I don't know what barrier may or may not be in your way for you to be more self-aware so that your relationship with God could not only grow and thrive, but your relationship with others. But there is a reason for the word of God being preached and the subject tonight. Whatever that reason is, God is willing and able to show you. So tonight, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. If you know God's calling you to something, to do something, do not harden your heart. Tonight, if you need to pray with somebody, to talk with somebody, there are a lot of people here who would love to do that, myself included. Tonight is the day of salvation. And tonight, Jesus says, come to me, all you are heavy laden, all you are weary, because my burden is light and my yoke is easy. Today, God says, whatever it is going on, I want to help. I want to be more involved in your story than I've ever been before. And tonight is a really good night to put your faith in Jesus if you haven't ever done that before. Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he is the only name by which all men, if they call upon it, can be saved. Let's pray.